and welcome everyone. Welcome to what is an important partnership between JTS and Park Avenue Synagogue. And I want to thank our JTS at PAS chairs, Ronnie Parker and Andrew Siegel, for working together with us and with JTS to make this fellows program happen. I want to get right to our guest this afternoon. I want to introduce Edna Friedberg. Edna is a JTS fellow and historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a graduate of the University of Illinois. She received her PhD in modern Jewish studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of American Jewish services for the elderly. Dr. Friedberg joined the staff of the Holocaust Museum in 1999. She has served as the historian of the online Holocaust Encyclopedia and now is the host of the museum's popular Facebook Live series. She also created a special exhibit on the legacy of the Nuremberg trials and post-war justice. Dr. Friedberg regularly speaks to audiences across the country, and her essays connecting Holocaust history with social, cultural, and political issues have appeared in The Atlantic, in the Chicago Tribune, in Slate, and The Forward. An alumna of Camp Ramah in Wisconsin, she serves as president of the board of trustees of the Milton Gottesman Jewish Day School of the nation's capital and is a member of Addis Israel Congregation in Washington, D.C. Dr. Friedberg, you reminded me that you were my TA in a class that I took at JTS in my fifth year, which then Chancellor Ismar Schorsch taught. I have long admired your work and your scholarship, and I am just so happy to welcome you to Park Avenue Synagogue and hope this is the first of many opportunities that we have to learn with you and from you. Dr. Friedberg.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckerman. Thank you, Neil. I believe I also was the TA for Rabbi Savinor and Rabbi Cosgrove. I should dig through my files and find who got the best grade among the three of you.
I actually won an award that year for the class that I wrote in Chancellor Schorsch's class. So
really,
if you graded it, thank you. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. I'm still waiting for you to pay me off for that, though. So really happy to be with you at Park Avenue, although I wish I could be there in person. And with luck, as we move into the after times from this pandemic, I do hope to visit you in person. But in the meantime, thank you for the invitation. As Rabbi Zuckerman said, I'm here. I am a historian at the Holocaust Museum, but also in my capacity as a fellow of JTS. And it's really a pleasure to be able to delve into these sources, to look at them through a more Jewish lens and to look at them as part of Jewish textual tradition, tradition in which the authors of the materials I'll share with you today were profoundly steeped, and they used it for inspiration, for hope, sometimes for humor. I will be sharing a lot of very dark material today, but not only. And so I hope I'll be leaving you with some sense of how people navigate challenging times and how Jewish texts can offer succor in those kinds of situations. But first, some historical context. By any measure, the Warsaw Ghetto was hell on earth. An urban prison zone in the middle of German-occupied Warsaw. After November 1940, the ghetto was enclosed by a 10-foot-high wall, topped with barbed wire and tightly guarded. German authorities packed over 400,000 people, Jews of all ages, into an area of just 1.3 square miles. There were an average of more than 7 people living in each room. Conditions were miserable: inadequate food, no sanitation, little heat, and by mid-1942, 83,000 Jews had died of starvation or disease. Of those who managed to survive, the Germans deported almost 300,000 of them to the Treblinka killing center to be gassed. And yet, in Warsaw and many other ghettos across occupied Poland, Jews organized clandestine schools and libraries, smuggling in books and other cultural materials in collective acts of spiritual resistance. Arguably, the most popular book in the Warsaw Ghetto was a novel, The 40 Days of Musa Da, written by Austrian-Czech writer Franz Werfel. Now, the Nazis had burned Werfel's earlier writings in May 1933, labeling them the poison fruits of a Jewish author who advocated pacifism, love for all mankind, and hostility to extreme nationalism, and therefore, by extension, hostility to Nazism. First published in Austria just a few months after the bigger Nazi book burnings, the 40 Days of Musa Dagh detailed the systematic expulsion and murder of up to 1 million Armenian Christians by authorities in the Ottoman Empire in 1915 to 16, a series of actions we now call the Armenian Genocide. And for those of you who follow the news, you've seen that just a few days ago, Joe Biden became the first US president to officially recognize these atrocities as genocide. This history remains heavily politicized, and it was true then as it is now. Now, what did this book have to do with Jews imprisoned in a ghetto? Why was it the bestseller, basically? Based on actual events of an armed revolt, in this novel, Franz Werfel shone a light on a group of Armenian men who were fighting under desperate conditions. And quickly translated from its original German into many languages, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh was critically acclaimed and widely read in both the US and Europe, except in Nazi Germany, where it was soon banned. I'm going to share my screen and try this. This is a cover. You can see nice, sort of melodramatic, the intense hero and the woman by his side of a copy of the book at the time. It was going to be made into a major motion picture starring Clark Gable, but actually under pressure from the Turkish authorities, the movie executive, the film executive, Louis Mayer, aborted the production. So even then, the idea of telling this story was controversial. Now, Franz Werfel cast the Armenian characters' armed revolt against their oppressors in a historic vein. As the editor of the New York Times Book Review wrote about the novel in 1934, and I quote, "It is a story which must rouse the emotions of all human beings, a story of men accepting the fate of heroes. It gives us the lasting sense of participation in a stirring episode of history." And let me read you a brief excerpt from the book. "For many people, it is depressing even to move house. A lost fragment of life always remains. To move to another town, settle in a foreign country is for everyone a major decision. But to be suddenly driven forth within 24 hours from one's home, one's work, the reward of years of steady industry, to become a helpless prey, to be sent defenseless out to Asiatic high roads with several thousand miles of dust, stones, and morass, to know that one will never again find a decently human habitation, never again sit down to a proper table. Yet this is all nothing. To be more shackled than any convict, to be counted as outside the law, a vagabond whom anyone has the right to kill unpunished." It doesn't take much imagination to see how such words would resonate with Jewish men and women and teenagers during the Holocaust. And indeed, just a few years after its publication, Werfel's tale of a besieged people taking control of its destiny captured the minds and hearts of those imprisoned in German ghettos. Copies of the novel were passed from hand to hand among members of Jewish youth groups marshaling the courage to revolt. And when leaders of the underground movement in the Bialystok ghetto debated whether or not to take up arms, they explicitly invoked Werfel's book. A young man there wrote, "Only one thing remains for us: to organize collective resistance in the ghetto at any cost, to consider the ghetto our Musa Dagh, to write a proud chapter of Jewish Bialystok and our movement into history." Leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto also drew strength from the struggle at Musa Dagh. Across Europe, Jews in mortal danger looked back one generation to the annihilation of the Armenians, and they saw themselves. Fiction had the power to do that for them. Now, in ghettos, cultural activity constituted a meaningful and life-sustaining form of cultural defiance. But let's begin by defining a term. What do I mean by spiritual resistance? I mean actions taken by individuals and groups to maintain their humanity, personal integrity, and dignity in the face of Nazi attempts to dehumanize and degrade them. In occupied Poland, as I mentioned, hundreds of clandestine schools were organized. Going to and from classes held in apartments and basements, students hid books under their clothing. Jews also opened underground libraries. One in the town of Częstochowa served more than 1,000 readers. These are people who are starving to death and still feel the need to nourish their minds. Activists also circulated some 60,000 volumes in the Theresienstadt ghetto near Prague. And here come some things that might surprise you. In ghettos, Jews also engaged, insofar as possible, in a variety of cultural gatherings. Unlike schools, events like these were not always forbidden by German authorities, and people were living in ghettos for months and months, year after year. They staged concerts of music ranging from opera to liturgical to jazz. They mounted lectures, put on theatrical productions, even cabarets and art contests. These events all offered outlets for stress and emotion, a sense of purpose, opportunities to gather with others in these artificial and hellish communities. And I'm going to show you another slide. Is it coming up or not?
Not yet.
Okay, bear with me. Sorry, these are the vagaries of running my own. There, do you see that now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. For a play called Shulamis or Sulamita, but you'll notice that the name of the theater company at the top is Teatr Novi Azazel, the New Azazel Theater. So Azazel, the traditional from Torah enemy of the Jews. Here we are in New Hell. We are in New Hell Theater is basically what they named this stage in Warsaw. There also was a reinvention of religious life in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I have here a picture of Rabbi Kalmanovich being forced to pose for a stage propaganda scene in his tallis and tefillin, really in a sort of stereotypical view, but it's the image that we have of him from the ghetto. The rabbi I was showing you there, sorry, I don't know his name. He's a rabbi in Kolbuszowa, which is a town in Galicia in southern Poland. So what else were they reading in the ghetto? They were reading Sidurim and Chumashim, their prayer books and their books of Torah and other religious texts. The Germans forbade religious services in most ghettos, so many Jews prayed and held ceremonies in secret, in cellars, in attics, and back rooms, as others stood watch, ready to warn them should a patrol come by. It's estimated that in 1940, in the Warsaw Ghetto alone, there were 600 such Jewish prayer groups that existed. Rabbinical authorities continued to adjudicate religious disputes on the basis of Jewish law, and there's a large body of responsa, of Jewish answers to questions, which attempted to adapt halakha to the changed and difficult circumstances in which the community found itself. Prayer helped to sustain morale, it reaffirmed cultural and religious identity, and it supplied spiritual comfort. And there were some Orthodox Jews who opposed the use of physical force, but viewed prayer and observance as the truest forms of resistance. Now, what I want to spend the bulk of our time on today is one of the most tangible and lasting forms of spiritual resistance, and that is the organizing of so-called ghetto archives, collections that documented daily life. The best known and largest of the ghetto archives was that in Warsaw, codenamed Oyneg Shabbos, Oyneg Shabbat, Joy of the Sabbath, and which was founded by historian Emanuel Ringelblum. The Oyneg Shabbos archive was secretly compiled between 1940 and 43 under Ringelblum's leadership, and some of you watching may have seen a recent documentary film about it that I highly recommend called Who Will Write Our History, a movie that really gives voice and face to this extraordinary effort. Members of the Oyneg Shabbos, and it was a whole army of team of people working to do this, and this was a forbidden activity. They gathered thousands of firsthand testimonies from natives of Warsaw and from hundreds of other locales to create a documentary record of the wartime fate of Polish Jews. And on April 18th, 1943, just one day before the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, A third and final part of the archive was placed in a metal box, and it was buried. 10 metal containers were later recovered in 1946 beneath the ruins of the ghetto, because that area of the city was entirely flattened. And so any landmark, if you picture a neighborhood that you know well and you say, turn right by the red brick building and left by the school, all of those orienting landmarks are gone after the destruction of the end of the war. Nevertheless, a second part of the archives was uncovered in December 1950, but the final cache was never found and is believed to still be buried somewhere underneath what is now the Chinese embassy. Now, an army of Sammlers, the Yiddish word for collectors, gathered some 35,000 pages. Now housed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and if you're ever in Poland, I highly recommend a visit there. It is a very powerful experience. The majority of materials collected by the members of Oynik Shabbos consists of writing. Pieces of paper that are things like diaries, studies of life in the ghetto that were commissioned secretly by the Oynik Shabbos, jokes, some of which I will share with you later, legends, religious disputes, also newspapers, ration cards, letters and postcards, German orders, posters like the one I showed you for musical and dramatic performances, school assignments, even tram tickets and candy wrappers. These inanimate objects are silent witnesses to a closed universe of a people under siege. But devastating violence lay between then and now. Between July and September 1942, German SS and police units, supported by ethnic Ukrainian auxiliaries, deported approximately 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. And the Germans demanded that members of the Ghetto Jewish Council, the Judenrat, assist in organizing these deportations. But the head of the council, Adam Chernyakov, refused to cooperate. Although Chernyakov is a complicated figure, some view him as a collaborator, others as a hero, and he did not directly call for resistance. He did not pass on the deportation order and instead committed suicide in July 1942 by swallowing a lethal dose of cyanide. A few slides to show you again. This is one of the milk cans. If you've been to the museum, the Holocaust Museum where I work in Washington, it is about 2.5 feet high, sort of an arm's way around. And much of the collection of the Oynik Shabbos was buried underground. That is why you see the rust and the soil on these. These were chosen because you picture that an object that is designed to keep liquid in will also keep liquid out when it is sealed. And so 4 of these milk cans, in addition to some other metal boxes, were buried underground, stuffed to the brim with papers, with artwork. You can see a close-up here of the seal, how it looks. And here is a picture, slightly grainy because it's a still from a film of Adam Chernyakov in the Jewish Council office with an SS official there to his side. But I want to talk now about a young woman we're seeing here. Her name is Gustava Jarecka. Now, Gustava Jarecka was working as a typist and telephone assistant at the Judenrat, and her position allowed her access to documents about deportations and other horrific measures. She was also secretly a member of the Oynik Shabbos archive, and she declared that, quote, "The record must be hurled like a stone under history's wheel in order to stop it." She saw it as incredibly important to gather and document what was happening to her community. And she passed items to the Oynik Shabbos to preserve evidence of what she saw as internal complicity. Now, Jarecka had been a teacher and a writer, leftist politically before the war. She was working, as I said, in the office. And we know, for example, that she is likely the source of a transcript of the meeting in July of 1942, in which the SS officer in charge dictated the order for this great deportation I talked about. In September 1942, she wrote a harrowing account titled "The Last Stage of Resettlement is Death." By that, she means the euphemism of resettlement that the Germans used to calm Jews and saying, "We're just resettling you to the east." She wrote this document written on 4 typewriters, clearly kind of dashing it out in secret, and it ends mid-sentence. She was a single mother to two sons named Marek and Karl, and they were deported to Treblinka in January 1943, and people who were with them report that she and her children died in the train transport, probably due to lack of access to air. I would like to stop talking about the Oyneg Shabbos and let you hear from the Oyneg Shabbos instead. I hope that you have the sources, the source packet, and we will only be reading part of it today. There are many more sources than we could keep at once. We will begin. So I've organized them, you'll see, based on ghetto. There are multiple ghettos in there. So we'll be jumping around in order, but they are all numbered. I'd like to call on Rabbi Zuckerman to read. We will begin with number 9, which is a source from the Warsaw Ghetto, written by Emanuel Ringelblum himself, the organizer. He was had previously, before the war, worked as a historian, a teacher, and just before the war had been sent by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to help stranded Jews who were in a no man's land between Poland and Germany. Let's read what he said about the Oyneg Shabbos. I see that the source sheet link, if you don't have it, is posted in the chat. Thank you, Ellie, very much for that. And Rabbi Zuckerman, if you would read us number 9, please, the translated words of Emanuel Ringelblum.
Summer of 1942, a new disaster descended upon the heads of the Warsaw Jews, a disaster that cost us 300,000 victims, the deportation. Only a very few comrades kept pen in hand during those tragic days, but the work was too sacred and too deeply cherished. The social function of Oyneg Shabbos too important for the work to be discontinued. We began to reconstruct the period of the deportation and to collect material on the slaughterhouse of European Jewry, Treblinka. On the basis of reports made by those who returned from various camps in the province, we tried to form a picture of the experiences of Jews in the provincial cities. If we only get some breathing space, we will be able to ensure that no important fact about Jewish life in wartime shall remain hidden from the world. We deliberately refrained from drawing professional journalists into our work because we did not want it to be sensationalized. Our aim was that the sequence of events in each town, the experiences of each Jew, and during the current war, each Jew as a world unto himself, should be conveyed as simply and faithfully as possible. Every redundant word, every literary gilding or ornamentation grated upon our ears and provoked our anger. Jewish life in wartime is so full of tragedy that it is unnecessary to embellish it with one superfluous line. Second, there was the matter of keeping a secret. And as is well known, one of the chief failings of journalists is that they reveal secrets.
Thank you for that. I know it's a long passage, but there's a lot in it to unpack. The humor at the end, the jab at journalists. People are still human beings, whatever the circumstance, with their opinions and biases and rivalries. But I also want to point out to you that he mentions Treblinka by name, that it is easy to think of places like ghettos and camps as completely sealed off and impermeable from the outside world. But clues like these also show us that information was flowing in different directions and that people had some knowledge of where they might be sent, what might be happening, and that kind of knowledge would fuel conversations and decisions about whether or not to engage in different forms of resistance, including violent resistance. Ringelblum instructed his staff that everyone should write as if the war is already over. He didn't want them to self-edit. He was looking at this with an eye towards the future. And it was very self-conscious. I would like to turn to something next, though, because much of what's in the Oyneg Shabbos archives is very, very human, very personal, and also painful to read. Mara, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to read something. It's a difficult passage from a man named Leib Golden. He wrote an extremely long story called Chronicle of a Single Day, and we'll read some excerpt from it. If you can read until it says food, food. This is source number 10 in your packet, Leib Golden writing Chronicle of a Single Day in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Sure. Yesterday, Friedman died of starvation. Of starvation? when you saw him naked, thrown into the gigantic mass grave. Everyone covered his nose with a handkerchief, except me and his mother. His throat was cut. Maybe he didn't die of hunger. Maybe he took his own life? Yes. No. People don't take their own lives nowadays. Suicide is something from the good old days. At one time, if you loved a girl and she didn't reciprocate, you put a bullet through your head. At one time, if you were sick with consumption, gallstones, or syphilis, you threw yourself from a fourth-floor window in a back street, leaving behind a stylized note with "It's nobody's fault, and I'm doing the world a big favor." Why don't we kill ourselves now? The pangs of hunger are far more terrible, more murderous, more choking than any sickness. Well, you see, all sicknesses are human, and some even make a human being of the patient, make him nobler. While hunger is bestial, a wild, a rawly primitive thing, if you're hungry, you cease to be human, you become a beast, and beasts know nothing of suicide. Keep going.
That's good. Thank you, Mara. Probably one of the most bitter things that you can ever read, but also just profoundly self-aware, and how much physical suffering comes to dominate. You will see Golden writes about hunger in other places as a character, almost a personified part of life. And a lot of pieces in the Oinig Shabbos archive talk about starvation and the need to jockey for food as dominating much of life. I have a few more slides to share with you again. Can you see that?
Yes.
Thank you. Here again, Gustave Jarecka, a photo of Emanuel Ringelblum with his young son, and Ringelblum and his family actually were smuggled out of the ghetto, not deported, were living under assumed identities on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw, then were betrayed. They were denounced and taken and murdered at the notorious Pawiak prison. So he did not live to see the fruits of his labors reach us. And I'm now showing you 2 pages from a diary. This is in the collection of the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, written by a man named Chaim Kaplan. Let me tell you a bit about Chaim Kaplan. Chaim Kaplan had been a Hebrew teacher, a scholar and instructor of Tanakh, of Bible, before the war, and he filtered all of the horrors of the ghetto through this language. He had been writing actually a lot in Yiddish before the war and made an ideological choice to keep this diary, a very detailed diary, in Hebrew in the ghetto. How do we have his diary? It was actually smuggled out of the ghetto by a man named Władysław Wojcik, a Pole who became a fugitive from police for 2 years while he provided shelter and care for a 3-year-old Jewish girl whose mother had begged him to take care of her daughter before she herself was deported to a death camp. So an incredibly heroic man. We have an excerpt for him on number 19 in your source packet. Give you a chance to turn toward it. And part of why I want us to look at this is because he has very mixed feelings. I've just been talking to you about the moral ambiguity of the Jewish Council, which in some ways was an arm or an agent of the German authorities. And also people who were connected with it had what we would call now protectia, influence, special treatment, access to better lodging, to heat, to food, to medical care. And there was a lot of resentment against them. Rabbi Zuckerman, if you don't mind reading, please, from Scroll of Agony, number 19, from Chaim Kaplan.
Of course. November 13th, 1941. The journal is my life, my companion and my confidant. Without it, I would be lost. In it, I pour out all my heart's feelings until I feel somewhat relieved. When I'm angry and irritable and my blood boils, when I am full of reproach and bitterness because I have so little strength and capacity to fight the vicious waves that threaten to engulf me. When my hands tremble with inner feeling, I take refuge in the journal and am immediately enwrapped in the inspiration of the Shekhinah, of God's presence, of creativity. Though I doubt whether the task of documentation with which I am occupied is worthy of being called creativity. In the future, let them evaluate it as they may. The main point is that I find repose for my soul in it, and that's enough for me. Why am I angry? Typhus has attacked my home too. My wife has contracted that dread disease. Her life is in great danger, and I must save her. Our material means are limited, infinitesimal. Only with great difficulty did I manage to earn a day's sustenance in normal times. In times of danger, when physicians, medics, and all sorts of healers frequent your house, and you must spend more than 100 zlotys a day on them, my strength is insufficient, and there's no help on the side. The joint, the distribution committee, community fund, and other social welfare institutions are open, but to a few, to those close to them, to bootlickers, to the director's lackeys who submit to his ways. And what am I? I have no foothold there.
Thank you. And you can hear Kaplan's visceral anger, that he is angry not only at the Germans who have imprisoned him and his fellow Jews there, but at the hierarchies and the exploitation and the corruption that he sees rampant in the ghetto. And there are tensions like this all over the Oyneg Shabbos archives. Ringelblum and others, for example, saw smugglers, those who would bring food and weapons and medicine and clothing and other things into the ghetto as heroes. And others who were involved in Oyneg Shabbos saw them as the scum of the earth. They thought they were exploiting people who were in desperate straits and were horrible. But Ringelblum wanted to record all of it, the good, bad, and the ugly. Similarly, someone like Chernyakov, the chair of the Jewish Council, who I described earlier, he was hated by people like Kaplan and other intellectuals, but Ringelblum thought it was very important that he should tell his own story in his own voice. And after he died, they took Chernyakov's diary and included it in the archive. So you have multiple perspectives. It's possible to look at events of a single day from several different angles, different viewpoints, and see how they're read. And that is really extraordinary and unusual. Before we open to questions, I want to give you a few other genres of material that are in this archive, because it is really quite varied, and there are also pieces of art and even some three-dimensional objects. I mentioned that there is poetry in it. Famous Hebrew poet, some of you may have heard of him, named Yitzhak Katznelson, is among those whose work is preserved in the archive. He was born near the town of Novogrodok, Yitzhak Katznelson, in what is now Belarus. And although he received a quite traditional religious education, his father ran some cheders there, some Jewish religious boys' schools, he became self-taught in secular studies and ran schools. One thing I want you to know also about him is that Katznelson was active with young people before the war. He was a mentor and a coach for the Dror Zionist youth movement. He founded the first Hebrew language gymnasium, the first Hebrew language high school in Poland. And so he knew and was quite familiar with a lot of teenagers and young adults. I'd like us to turn to a source from him. Let me see what number that is. Number 11 in your source packet. It's number 11, Song of Hope, by the poet Yitzhak Katznelson. And Mara, if you would be willing to read that, please. Number 11.
Come out, my dear, onto the street. Come and die on the street, on the hard sidewalk. Bring our pale children. Bring the eldest, bring the middle one. Our third is very young yet, but like a grown Jew, is able to die of hunger on the street. Come onto the street, come on to Carmelika. Here we fit in well. Some fall, some stay sitting. There is a hubbub on the Carmelika. Come out. Oh, leave the house, the empty house. I'd be ashamed to live there in a living grave. A starving man should not die lonely in his home. No cause for shame on the street. People go out, lie down, swollen, tight-belted. A whole legion dies together. They are dying wholesale, wholesale. We too will lie down on the sidewalk. No, not lie down, we'll fall. No, no, not fall down, lie down. Heart to heart and die with the rest.
It's hard to think of a bleaker poem. I don't really want to comment a lot on it other than to say that the poetry of Katznelson, and this one obviously incredibly ironically titled Hope, a song to hope, is anything but. But at the same time, Katznelson really did provide a lot of inspiration through his poetry to others. As I mentioned, he was a mentor and intellectual leader for many youth and was very close friends with Yitzhak Antek Zuckerman, who was one of the main leaders of the violent Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He considered him his rabbi in a way, his spiritual leader. And I mention this because it's easy to think about Jews coming here as almost blank slates, but they arrive in ghettos, they arrive in camps with their full personalities, with their full networks of friendships and people they dislike and ideological battles. And these pre-war networks endure and are replicated and amplified in the environment of the ghetto. And so it's important to know what people were like before, because it completely shapes how they react and who they work with or work against once they are in the ghetto. I'd like to move away to a few other genres of ghetto literature or ghetto cultural production and go to the hometown of Katznelson, the city of Lodz. We'll be reading a passage from what I think is one of the most significant Holocaust diaries available anywhere, and much, much less known than someone like Anne Frank or others. I think partially because the boy who wrote it had a very difficult to pronounce last name. His name is David Sharakowiak, Sirakowiak. He's number 7 and 8 in your source packet. It is available in an English translation, a wonderful English translation, in a paperback, and he kept a diary. He started writing in this diary before the war. He got it as a graduation or as end of year present in June 1939, and he continues writing until April of 43, talking from a teenage point of view about what his life is like. Rabbi Zuckerman, if you could read, please, number 8, very typical entry from the diary of David Sharakowiak, number 8, writing in the Lodz ghetto, a teenage boy.
Monday, May 26, 1941. All is okay in school. We're working on Cicero. Next week, it will be metrics. In math, we're doing square roots and soon solid geometry. In other subjects, except for German, we're behind. I'm organizing a school paper for which I've submitted a caricature. Maybe one of my Yiddish articles will be accepted this time, though so far none have passed the censor. Even the ghetto has its own bourgeois ideology, distinctly formulated. Not all is well at home. Mother works from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. and father from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The household chores are done by Nadia. She gets only one soup a day and has a 30, I'm not sure what that measurement is. But
Decagram, sorry.
Decagram, it's small, I know that, of bread, because she and mother both give father 10 decagrams, which he doesn't even appreciate. His attitude toward them is bad and shows great egotism.
Thank you. Now, what I love about this diary and why I chose this entry is just the sheer ordinariness of it. This is a kid who's in a terrible, terrible situation, but still is really recognizable as an adolescent voice. You know, he's in school, he doesn't like the adults who restrict what he does. He has a dysfunctional family with a really nasty father, and that is all true. It would have been true outside, and it's true here. And he channels his frustrations into this diary. It's not easy to get paper. It's not easy to get ink. He couldn't run down to the corner store and pick up a ballpoint pen. So it's a real commitment to do this, and an incredible document. David, as I said, started writing 3 months before the occupation of Poland. He continues writing until April 43. And we know from records that he died in August of 1943, 2 weeks after his 19th birthday, 4 weeks after the last of his surviving notebooks broke off with the recognition. The last words that he left for us were, "There is really no way out of this." I'm going to leave you with two final pieces of very different and I hope more hopeful kinds of sources that have been preserved for us in these ghetto archives. First, some humor, which may be surprising, but I think many of us use dark humor as a way of coping, as a way of dealing with or showing some mastery over a situation. And there is a lot of Holocaust jokes. People say, is it okay to tell jokes about the Holocaust now? Well, I can tell you that during the war, people told jokes about the Holocaust. They needed to. There is a collection of ghetto humor and folklore collected by an anthropologist named Shimon Huberband. It appears from starting number 13 in your source packet. There are a number of jokes in a row. And I will read you a few of them, starting again with number 13, Warsaw Ghetto Humor. A teacher asks his pupil, "Tell me, Moishe, what would you like to be if you were Hitler's son?" And the pupil answers, "An orphan." It's really hard to tell jokes when I can't tell if anyone smiles or laughs. Like I just feel like I'm like dying, you know, like the worst. So feel free to unmute for a minute. Number 15, again, this is a joke that was popular in the ghetto. Number 15, Jews are now very pious. They observe all the mitzvot, all the ritual laws. They're stabbed and punched with holes like matzahs and have as much bread as on Passover. They're beaten like hoshanas, like your lulav at Sukkot. They're rattled like Haman. They are green as esrogim, as your etrog, as Sukkot. They fast as if it were Yom Kippur. They're burnt as if it were Hanukkah, and their moods as if it were Tisha B'Av, as if it were the 9th of Av. So taking, you know, Jewish calendar, Jewish archetypes, and laying it on as thickly with irony as they possibly can. One more joke that I will read you, number 16, and there are a whole collection of these. No garbage was permitted to be taken out of the ghetto. A Jewish ghetto administrator, so someone from the Jewish council, appeared before his German commissar to request permission to remove garbage accumulating in his home. And when the Jew came into the commissar's office and did not raise his arm in the Hitler salute, the commissar became furious and threw him out of the room. A few days later, the Jewish administrator appeared a second time in the commissar's office. And the commissar was certain that this time the Jew would salute him by raising his arm. And indeed, the Jew entered his room, raising his arm. So the commissar addressed the Jew and said, "Aha, this time, Yuda, you acted correctly by raising your arm in the Hitler salute." "No, Mr. Commissar," the Jew answered. "I just wanted to show you how high the garbage has gotten." So thank you for the laugh, Mara. There are a lot of these, and I find them so extraordinary because it shows the humanity, the way that people coped, and that people are just people wherever they are. You're going to hear me repeating this over and over, but I just feel these sources illustrate it in a way that a lot of typical Holocaust study does not, where Jews are just kind of flattened as victims instead of being fully human, grappling with an inhuman situation. For the final source that I want to show you will be number 23. This is from the Vilna Ghetto in Lithuania, and it is actually a sermon that was delivered in the ghetto, that was preached in the ghetto by a man named Zelig Kalmanovich. He was he was a linguist and one of the early directors of the YIVO. You may know the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. He rediscovered faith in the ghetto. He became observant. He switched in speaking and writing from Yiddish to Hebrew in his journal to show his reorientation. And he here is preaching about something known as the sacred triad. Without going into too much detail, this is a much older concept, first conceived by a Kabbalist named the Ramchal in Italy in the early 1700s, and it was later popularized by the Vilna Gaon, a leader of Misnagdic or non-Hasidic Jewry. So he's drawing again on a much older religious tradition to make sense of it. Number 23, and Rabbi Zuckerman, if you would read this for us, please.
To be a Jew means in every instance to be on a high plane. The temporary suffering and blows that descend upon the Jews have a meaning, are not merely oppressions, and do not degrade the Jew. For a Jew is part of the sacred triad, Israel, the Torah, and the Holy One, blessed be he. That means that the Jewish people, the moral law, and the creator of the universe. This sacred triad courses through history. It is a reality that has been tested countless times. Our grandfathers clung to the triad, lived by its strengths, and now too, the Jew who does not cling to this triad is to be pitied. He wanders in a world of chaos. He suffers and finds no explanation for his suffering. But the Jew who clings to the sacred triad needs no pity. He is in a secure association. To be sure, history rages now. A war is waged against the Jews. But the war is not only against one member of the triad, but against the entire one, against the Torah and God, against the moral law and the creator. Can anyone still doubt which side is the stronger? In a war, it happens that one regiment is defeated, taken into captivity. Let the ghetto Jews consider themselves as such prisoners of war. But let them also remember that the army as a whole is not defeated and cannot be defeated. The Passover of Egypt is a symbol of ancient victory. My wish is that together we shall live to see the Passover of the future.
Thank you. And again, using older Jewish tradition, the cadence of the Jewish calendar, ritual, and longer Jewish history as a way to anchor and give some sense of hope and continuity, I think is very, very profound. The ghetto residents of some 80 years ago, they intuitively understood the power of memory, of holding fast to their own private memories of normal life, of steadfastly preserving their religious and cultural values, even in a place of intense suffering and mortal threat. They read novels, as we heard. They wrote poetry, they sang songs and cracked dark jokes. They presciently saw a future which would want, even need, to examine and learn from the horrors of their time. Now, in closing, a 19-year-old boy named David Graber was among the Oyneg Shabbos commandos. No teenager should ever have to confront his own mortality, yet that is just what David did when he wrote his aunt's own last will and testament for inclusion in the Oyneg Shabbos archives. And his last hope was this: what we were unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world, so that the world may know all. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened. This was a young person with so little time to live, and yet possessing a worldview that stretched far into the future and even retained a glimmer of optimism that someone would be there, that someone would care, that someone would listen. He was deeply and profoundly self-aware, forced into that mindset by a life cut short. Thankfully, you and I, we cannot truly understand David's circumstances. We were born into a much kinder and safer time and place, but we can draw inspiration from the long time horizon the Oyneg Shabbos embodies. How do we hope to be remembered by those who will study our society in the future? What record do we leave behind, even if it is stored in the digital cloud rather than in metal boxes or milk cans? The Jews of Warsaw and other ghettos would not concede the telling of their lives and deaths to their murderers. By writing down what was happening to them in their own words, they reclaimed some measure of control over their humanity. And what Ringelblum referred to as a sacred society repeatedly took on potentially fatal risks in order to collect and preserve the voices of the ghettos. Through the bold acts of Ringelblum, Gustava Jarecka, and their colleagues, we have a time capsule of life in this artificially created hellscape. Their lives, their suffering, their aspirations are suspended in amber for us to pore over. What they buried beneath the ground continues to speak to us, even though they would not themselves live to tell the tale or even to see who might unearth it. Thank you.
Dr. Friedberg, Edna, Very powerful. Thank you. Those sources are just incredible. And you used a phrase when you were speaking about the last boy, David, who wrote that very moving, in some ways, wrap up of this. You called him the Oyneg Shabbos Commando, right? And I'm the first one to sort of, get behind and celebrate the partisan fighters who were in the woods and in the ghettos. But I've long felt, and you referred to it as spiritual resistance. I've long felt that the book smugglers, the Oyneg Shabbos commandos, all the people who were documenting this, and at some great risk to their life, are just it's a very different and yet critical kind of heroism. And I wonder if you can speak a little more to that, right? The choice of words, the spiritual resistance, the Oyneg Shabbos commandos, right? How does this sort of allow us to, like, what was at risk? I mean, obviously life was at risk always, but right, the how do we have these diaries? Like, who was smuggling these, and at what risk to their lives? And what does this how does this redefine some of the heroism of what we think comes out of the Shoah? A lot of questions, but all generally around that same idea.
So part of the way I think about it is about trade-offs and choices, that anything that a human being is doing in this situation where life itself is so tenuous and the basic necessities to survive physically are so scarce and fought over, that a decision to work on anything else is taking away energy and possibly money or valuables that can be traded for that. So I made reference, for example, to finding paper to work on it, or to someone like Gustava Jarecka. We know, because we can see from it's literally forensic evidence, that she's typing this thing out in different typewriters and stolen moments. She can't use up lots of ink in this official office from her typewriter reel to do something that is forbidden. Even thinking about how you ask a favor. Chaim Kaplan's diary, as I mentioned, was smuggled out of the ghetto by this heroic Polish man who also smuggled a child out of the ghetto. You're using up your capital with someone to say, save my diary, perhaps in lieu of another life. Many people, the smugglers who I mentioned, who brought materials in and who had a very mixed reputation, were seen as parasites by some ghetto residents and as heroes by others. They're taking scarce resources. People are not coming into the ghetto the way they come into a camp, where they are stripped of their belongings. And so there are still economic stratifications there, and people who come in with cash, with jewelry, with other valuables that they can trade and barter for advantages. And so the fact that people took on this kind of activity and decided to do it meant it was a choice not to do something else, not to bring food, not to use their money or their connections, for example, for armed resistance. And it's something I think about, especially when I'm educating younger people who are often quite captured by stories of violent resistance. They like to think, I would have grabbed, whatever 2x4 was near me and hit that German in the head or something. I think those are really fascinating and complex moral questions. Is it better to die, what I've heard one survivor term a collective suicide in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, or to survive? Is the mere act of tenacity and living until whatever day this hell might end actually a more meaningful form of survival? I don't know. One final point that I'll answer to your question, though, also is for us to think about our own Jewish modern ritual calendar and dates that have been added, dates that we have just finished, the progression from Yom HaShoah to Yom HaZikaron, so the Holocaust Memorial Day as declared by the State of Israel in the early 1950s, to Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, when we mourn the sacrifice and loss of fallen soldiers, to Yom HaAtzmaut, the celebration of Israel independence. This is a very particularly Zionist narrative and a very particular interpretation of the Holocaust, because the date of Yom HaShoah is selected because it aligns with the Warsaw Ghetto violent uprising. And so this was a deliberate choice on the part of early labor Zionist leaders in the newly created state of Israel to emphasize this as the point of focus in thinking about the Holocaust. That those who died during the Holocaust, or those who were, quote, led like lambs to the slaughter, are not our heroes, but that our heroes are the ones who fought with bullets or with knives, even if they knew it was a hopeless fight. And I say this without moral judgment. I can make a strong argument for any of these kinds, but just to complicate, I know it's not the way that I was taught about the Holocaust growing up. It was not about spiritual resistance. It was much more about the glorification of violent or armed uprising. And to think that a lot of that has been very specifically framed for us in that way because of a worldview or an ideology of the people who were establishing those holidays and also establishing Yad Vashem. There is a question here, David Goldstein asking, is the Zionist youth movement in Poland reflected in any of the Ghetto Diaries as a ray of hope? Absolutely. Really good question. It is absolutely there. It shows up in very easily measurable ways in terms of the who become the leaders of many of these violent uprisings. Even just think about the fact that they're young, because the kind of people who feel both immortal enough, to think I will just risk my life and try things, but also people without dependence are much more likely to do something radical, like trying something violent or something very risky, because they don't have anyone who's relying on them. Whereas someone my age, in middle age, a mother, a wife, someone who might have elderly parents, would feel that they don't have the right necessarily or the freedom to take such a risk. And it is heavily Zionist youth groups. I mentioned the Dror earlier, but also Hashomer Hatzair and others, and also some socialist, Bundist, Yiddish youth groups that come to the fore in galvanizing ghetto residents for underground networks and for violent resistance. And some of it has to do, in the Zionist case, of an emphasis pre-war and post-war on also physicality, that they were trying to take European Jews and turn them into a more muscular, tough form of modern Jew. And that comes to its embodiment in the ghetto. So there are other sources like that. If you want to email me after, I'm happy to point you to some of those.
Dr. Friedberg, one quick question before we wrap up. I am, I've read about this for so long, and this missing milk can, right? Is there some like treasure hunt in process to try and discover this, or is this lost to history?
If I were a betting person, I'd say it's lost to history. I mean, people have used kinds of, imaging devices and other technology, engineering technology. As I said, we think probably based on being able to lay over maps and knowing where the ghetto used to be, that it's very likely to be underneath what is now the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, which is not the easiest place also to ask to do excavation work. I think there, from what I've heard, politics and suspicion that there isn't really a milk can and people just want to go there in order to plant some things. So it's not an area that can be freely dug up, but I would never say never, because imagine if we could find it. I mean, it's a time capsule that's just there, and it who knows what it contains. So people have tried, let me put it that way.
Wow. I want to thank you, Dr. Friedberg. I know there's a lot more to say about this. You started to touch on another topic that I know you've written a lot about, and that is Holocaust education in general and how we sort of position it. That'll all happen another time, I hope. But I want to thank you for just a very interesting and moving hour of looking at these archives and understanding better the motivation for people to engage in this type of spiritual resistance. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Again, thank you to Ronnie and to Andrew Siegel, Ronnie Parker and Andrew Siegel, our the chairs of our JTS and PAS committee for making this happen. And we will see you at our future sessions with JTS fellows. So everyone, please have a great day. Again, Dr. Friedberg, Yasher Koch to you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being our teacher. and we will see you soon.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.